This week on the Eldritch Lorecast.
What's the Ranger's capstone?
Never exhausted.
Damn it, just like before.
I'm the host now.
As it currently stands, we're not really talking about this playtest packet much now.
Mission accomplished.
I'm looking at Foe Slayer and I feel like I'm losing my mind.
Look at this segue.
So bad.
Ooh, yeah.
You love to be an annoying DM, Shawn.
Oh, I love to be an annoying human being.
I'm going to do my wiggles just before James.
Dan Dillon's on the team now.
Get your wiggles out, James. All that and more right now.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, the #1 tabletop RPG podcast in all the realms, getting the original party back together this week. What's it been, like 5 weeks, a month, something like that? My name's Ben Byrne, joined as always by Dael Kingsmill, Shawn Merwin, James Hake. And James, I have a question for you that you actually asked on social media. Speak of the devil. What is a mechanic, if you're in charge of designing 5.5, 6e, 1 D&D, whatever we're calling it, what is a mechanic that you would add? Now, this is, according to your own question specifically, that not a mechanic that you would change, not something that you would fix, but something completely new that you would add to the system.
A more involved wilderness exploration mechanic for our poor, underserved exploration pillar.
Well, have I got great news for you. Shawn Merwin, do you want to describe such an exploration mechanic that exists within Aurora, Age of Desolation? This podcast not specifically sponsored by Aurora, Age of Desolation.
Although it may be soon. In Aurora, you can get an in-depth survival and exploration system where your very skill and your very tool proficiencies will dictate whether you and your whole community lives or dies. Easy as that, simple as that.
I didn't intend for this to be such a beautiful, silky smooth segue into promoting a Ghostfire product, but you know, while I'm here, yeah, check out Aurora. Aurora slaps.
So what I would put in is a rating system.
Of the Valiant clans!
You know, it's 5e.
Dael Kingsmill, what epic Ghostfire gaming subsystem would you add to
I was going to say
5e?
transformation.
Welcome to Etheris.
To answer the actual question without a Ghostfire product, because you all took them all. What I want to see is mechanics that encourage roleplay without overly structuring the content of roleplay itself. And I was thinking about this the other day after I did a video where I was stealing more stuff from video games to put in tabletop RPGs, but thinking about like a sort of bonds and rivalries sort of a system, and the idea that you could tie the gaining of mechanical benefits to downtime stuff, right? So if you do X thing during your downtime, if you spend time training with one of the other party members, then your bond increases and you get a bond feature. So just a little thing that like pushes you to have a little roleplay scene without telling you what must happen during that scene.
I like the balance that you've put in there, because that's the thing that I find anytime that like you try to mechanicalize, I'm making that word, social encounters for me, it very quickly starts to feel like mind control as soon as it's kind of like, well, if this role is successful, this person has to do what I say. Anyway, you can see I'm not rusty at all after skipping a week. On to the news this week, and boy howdy, is there a lot of news. That's right. The Witcher Old World board game is now in stores. You can get a copy. It's pretty fantastic by Go On Board. I've played it twice solo. Check it out. It's kind of cool. Also, season 3 of The Witcher has dropped on Netflix. If you're not a fan, maybe skip it. If you are a fan, definitely skip it. It's kind of a little bit on the nose. And I started playing The Witcher 3 again because there was so much Witcher in my life during my break. I'm up to the Crohn's Book Crookback Bog.
The #1 Witcher podcast in all of the planes.
Yeah.
#1 Witcher podcast.
Yeah, that's it. That's right. And that's about all we've got time for. Did anything else big happen this week that I didn't see while I was away?
The orc license dropped. Is that important?
Yeah, sure. I had a look at that. I didn't put it on the run sheet only because the news that I read was that it hasn't changed that much since we last looked at it, except to specify that you could include non-rules, non-mechanics in your orc product and attach it to the license. Am I remembering that correctly, Shawn?
I have no idea.
Playtest packet number 6. The longest playtest packet since the previous longest playtest packet. has now dropped. There are 7 classes in this playtest packet. That's all. That's most of them, actually, I think, or half of them. Is there 14
More than half.
classes or 12?
It's 12.
Thoughts? Go. Do conversation.
All
You did it
right,
last
then.
week. Do it again.
Just,
I have
just tee
questions.
us up, won't you?
Very smart game designers and players and people. Is it better to make a game more playable or a game that caters to people who want to feel more powerful? And therefore more sales.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
I like that question because I find as a GM, I get very scared of any sort of player power increase to the point that often I find when it hits the table, oh, it's not that bad. But I'm glad that I may not be the only one feeling that way. I have no answer for you, though.
I will return your question with another question, okay? Because what is the goal, right? Is it to build a new player base, keep getting more new people into the game, or is it to keep a hold on the ones that you already have and that player base that you've established?
That's a good question.
It definitely feels like through this whole process, they're trying to do both, right? Like that's what this, we've been saying it for 6 to 12 months now. That's what this whole thing feels like, is the rock and the hard place that they're in between the game not stagnating and just losing players through attrition, moving through to other systems because they've grown bored, and not alienating the fan base that they have by doing a cut and run kind of entirely new system. And this whole playtest kind of thing has felt like the way to massage people through to keep as much of their audience as they can while insisting that they're doing something new and fresh. Look, to their credit, I think largely the playtest feedback that they've been getting has been impacting these playtests. And I think we see that with the Druid particularly, in terms of the fact that they were like animal of the land, animal of the sea, whatever. And now they've walked that right back to, well, you can change into theoretically anything, but added some restrictions on there that are still in the spirit of why they made those changes, being that now a druid has to prepare their animals that they can transform into, which I think is a fantastic change in terms of just creating something that the GM can anticipate and expect, but also from someone who's very into theme and tone and atmosphere in their games, not setting like this horror atmosphere and then having an octopus suddenly like burst onto the scene helps, I think.
Depends on the octopus.
Octopi are terrifying.
I think both of those goals are sub-goals of the larger objective, which is to create a game in which you feel like a hero. And any sort of heroic pursuit, is going to have to grapple with either sides of those issues, because feel like a hero is an incredibly broad term. Some heroic feelings come from that sort of sense of power fantasy that, for example, 4th edition provides so well, where you are all but superhuman at first level and you can face continually more fantastical threats as you gain strength. And some people find that feeling of heroism in the rise from absolute nothing, where you're first level in 5e, but really more like first level in like AD&D first edition, where you are a wizard with 4 hit points, and if a mummy looks at you wrong, all of a sudden you're dust on the floor, and then sort of surviving the terrors of sort of mortaldom is the price that you must pay in order to gain great heroism later on. Just like with 5e, I think Wizards wants to have their cake and eat it too. Both types of people, both sides of that sort of element of heroic fantasy are going to be playing this game. And 5e somehow managed to thread the needle. Now they want to do it again. How hard could it be? Well, as it turns out, it's very easy to make an unpopular idea. And sometimes an unpopular idea is a good one. I think there was a lot of good stuff going on in the Druid sort of like basic forms, the animal of the land, etc., minus that miserable name. When I was looking at this new playtest packet, seeing Druid being back to the same sort of choose any animal stat block with this laundry list of conditions, it just made me kind of sigh. Because, yes, on one hand, it's extremely flexible. It's just like what we had in the old game with, I think, a few minor tweaks. But it doesn't feel like, it's a barrier that I see towards getting a new player into playing a druid for the very first time. I want to bring in my friend who's never played D&D before, and not only are they having to learn spellcasting, they're going to look at Wild Shape and be like, oh, well, I can do this, right? And it's like, yes, you can, but also remember a solid 2 inches of page worth of fine print, 3 inches worth. And unless I really want to rely on my player knowing all of that stuff at the table, that's on me as the DM to keep in my head.
See, I still vastly prefer it to the Animal of the Land basic forms. Even I do agree that there were good ideas behind that. I didn't like the execution, and I do prefer this. And I think part of it is because they have shifted that thing that they were doing for a while, particularly with spells, where they were saying, you get these spells, or alternatively choose, right? And they've shifted that, and they do have a list in there that say, if you don't want to go through the trouble of choosing the animals that you want to turn into, then pick a horse, a wolf, and a spider. Boom, you're done. And I think that is a really good way of approaching helping out newer players. I maybe would recommend like short lists that they can choose from, so you maintain that sense of choice. But that thing of narrowing down the options for a new player who feels overwhelmed, I think is a good middle ground. And I don't think that it's, something that hurtful.
And who's to say, with the power of the upcoming VTT, maybe we really will be able to just pick a list of animals and say, I want to turn into this. And all of a sudden, boom, it's, you gain that animal stat block, and the computer has already given you the replacements of your hit points, your hit dice, intelligence, wisdom, charisma scores, class features, species, traits, languages, feats, skills, saving throw proficiency bonus. It'll do all that.
What was that middle one?
Yeah, I know, right? Say those again, please, backwards. If
you look at the ranger, beast companion person, they have like land animal, sea animal, air animal as their companion options. But I actually mind that a lot less with the ranger, because it feels like what that is trying to accomplish, much more specifically, is a combat companion, somebody who you leap into combat and the wolf jumps off the ledge next to you and you both dive into the pile of kobolds or whatever it is. That works much simpler and much easier, and I prefer that for the ranger. So you can see that they're not entirely trying to go. There's a lot of keywording that's going into the game now, and a lot of standardization. All subclasses are now, part of me, starting at 3rd level, and yet they've walked back the idea that all subclass bonuses across all classes all kick in at the same levels throughout kind of progression. So they're not being overly consistent. They're kind of making changes where it makes sense and then walking back others where either it wasn't as popular or perhaps it didn't make as much sense, but they're trying new things kind of over here or over there.
I also think it's really interesting to see, they tried something very new with the Ranger and with the Druid and Wild Shape, and people didn't like it. And to see them not create something new again that is more in line with what people wanted, but instead go back to, broadly speaking, what we had before with some specific changes implemented, which to me seems to tell us what was important to them in this, class feature change. And that is hit points. Broadly, hit points was the problem. They didn't want you to have this massive bucket of tankable damage. And so, it's not necessarily what I would have done if I was designing, a new approach to Wild Shape, but I think that it functions.
I think the designers who are on the actual D&D design team, people who we have met with in the wild here, in the US at least, know what the problems are. And that's good. That gives me a lot of hope to have them understand that the problem is too many hit points. Because in the past, we have had design teams that did not understand simple fundamental problems like that. So that does give me hope that they are at least moving in the right direction. And even as we see these changes come and go and revert, we still don't know what the final thing is going to look like. In some cases, even for the D&D Next playtest, we never saw in a playtest packet what the final answer was.
No,
when it came out. So that's okay too. That's okay.
I'm
too.
still waiting for damage on a miss to come back. When are we going to get damage on a miss in this playtest packet?
That leads to my next question. I'm the host now.
Look at me.
What
Look at me.
was somebody's comment last week cracked me up, which is when Shawn disappeared, somebody commented in Twitch saying you need to create a lineage now to figure out who the host becomes
It's
afterwards.
like when Kirk isn't on the bridge, first he goes to Spock and then to Sulu and then to Scotty.
There you go. Like, why is Scotty injured? Oh, right, everybody else has left. Gotcha.
The idea of the hero, the superheroic character, and the idea of damage on a miss leads me to the question: can a game like D&D focus too much on success when success doesn't necessarily mean everything in each individual instance of a game or of a combat, of a check?
This is very interesting.
Dael and I are both wiggling with excitement.
Other games have fail forward mechanics, right? Where the failure is actually more interesting than a success would have been. And D&D is a different game, obviously. I'm not saying we should move in that direction, although you can, but can the game focus so much on someone working hard to succeed that the game is worse off for it?
Rafa Taffy just hit the buzzword. I feel like if we were on QI, suddenly a would go off with like somebody hitting the buzzword, which is, does success in battle makes the game faster? Wouldn't it slow the game down if there are more failure effects? And I just feel like speed up the game or slow the game down is that buzzword of like the kind of sits in a similar basket of concern, which is like, does the game have to focus on success? Is success more fun than failure? Do we need to really ensure that players are succeeding as much as possible, even if they're failing forward? In the same basket as, does the game have to be quick? Do we got to like get through this as pacey as possible? Do we, speed at all costs, get rid of anything that like slows the game down? Anyway, sorry.
But I want to counter that with sometimes success, the hoops you jump through to succeed take longer than a failure would have taken. Take the Bard, for example, where now when do you roll that die? Well, you roll after you know that you failed. Okay, so now, no, I'm sorry, you failed. Oh, does anybody know what the armor class actually is? Because how much I rolled a 13 and I missed. Do you know what the armor class on a Storm Giant is? I think it's an 18. Well, is it an 18? Now, if I roll the 8-sider now, I have a 50% chance of hitting. Should I save it for when I know those sorts of things happen? And it's all for a success on maybe an attack that would mean very little in the overall combat. So that's where sort of this question comes from. And now I will be quiet.
I'm going to do my wiggles just before James, just because I think you're going to have more to say about it. My wiggles are purely talking about just the fuller context in terms of game design. We're talking about the fact that D&D is and other D20 systems are relying on averages over time, right? So the reason combat works towards the game design, whereas something like skill checks doesn't, is because this game is relying on, you've got these big bonuses to your roll, so as long as you roll more than a 5, you're probably going to succeed or whatever, right? And so because you have more rolls during combat, you are going to trend more towards your high average that you get through your bonuses, right? So this is a game that really relies on you rolling a lot in order to see those bonuses sort of play out and lead to successes, right? So failure becomes much more of a component of a D20 system game versus games that Shawn mentioned where failing forward is a big part of the game design, or games like Gumshoe, where you just automatically succeed. If you have that thing, there is no roll. You just get the information that you want. There are game designs that are very deliberately skewed towards progress no matter what. And D20 systems are not one of those. All right, get your wiggles out, James.
All of the things you've had to say have created such a mud puddle in my mind that it's like, it's all great, but it's like I've had red paint poured in and then green paint poured in and then yellow paint poured in, and it's like I'm trying to sieve the paint back into cogent thoughts into their primary colors again. This is such a fascinating argument because it all leads me to think Are people trying to get D&D to do too many different things? Are people trying to play D&D when they'd rather play a different game? And I hate going this route because it's such a it's like I'm taking scissors to a knot rather than actually trying to untangle it. And it's usually deployed in such bad faith that I hate to go that direction. But like what you're talking about, Dael, with D20 systems and what they're intending to do, typically a lot of these problems that we face, problems of experiential problems in play, are the result of people trying to play D&D in a way that is not necessarily perpendicular, but often sometimes completely contrary to the way that D&D's design encourages you to play it. Despite the designers saying, I think with very good reason, that D&D can be whatever you want it to be. Not only is that one great for marketing, but it's also basically the way that people have played D&D since the game was made, is just kind of hacking it into bits and doing whatever they want with it. So, I don't think that's a cynical thing for the designers to say, but it really does give them a very big problem to solve, which is this: when they're trying to streamline gameplay and create, because good narrative comes from failure and overcoming failure, not just like succeeding, or, you miss an attack, not from inconsequential failure, like I missed an attack and had to wait 15 minutes for my next turn, but big failure, like the villain knocked me on my ass and I had I had an existential breakdown over it. And then I found, the spirit that lives in my heart, and I've gained great power, and now I can go on. D&D does nothing to simulate that. That's on the dungeon master to provide. And when you approach D&D stories, the sort of linear adventures that Wizards publishes, adventures that, kind of by necessity have to be linear, otherwise they would sprawl on for 1,000 pages of flowcharts, etc. There's no room for that because you can't predict the sort of beauty that a player will bring to the game. And so really the best examples of seeing D&D in play are D&D actually in play. If we made D&D play the way people play D&D, it wouldn't be D&D anymore. And that is the ultimate problem that I think these designers have to face.
I'm a big fan of failure, and I'm a big fan of like my heroic fantasy, as somebody mentioned or my power fantasy, I should say, as somebody mentioned in the chat way earlier when we first brought up the idea of heroic fantasy, is that a hero isn't somebody who is some kind of like super metahuman who faces no adversity and saves others, but rather a hero is somebody who makes difficult choices as best they can and, succeeds despite the odds. And so I prefer to play games where it feels like I face great adversity, but come out on top nevertheless, not unscratched or unscathed. Whereas D&D sometimes struggles to capture that atmosphere because it is really, I think, going for more of that. You are a band of great heroes. You are Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli, and largely you get out unscathed from the great battles that you go through. And so as I think to myself, I'm like, well, yes, it does suck when you miss an attack on your turn, especially pre-level 5. Once fighters and fighters and monks is who I'm thinking of, and barbarians get to the point where they can make 2 attacks a turn, that stings a little bit less because you get 2 opportunities to attack and you're probably going to hit at least one of them. If you miss both, yeah, it sucks, but you had, 2 opportunities. And how do you make that more interesting? Well, I think you're starting to play a different system. Not to over-labor the Witcher Watch this week, but the Witcher RPG puts in a system where you can defend on your turn actively. You can choose to dodge, parry, or block an attack, which means that if you fail, it feels like the game playing back against you rather than you just not getting a high enough number on your dice.
Well, that's it, right? Like something that Colville used to say in videos is that a lot of players, they don't want to be like Superman. They want to be like John McClane in Die Hard. They want to get their ass kicked the whole way through the adventure, but still win at the end, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that failure in the sense of I'm meant to be a fighter, I'm meant to be good with a sword, and I just miss my attack and that sucks.
Sure.
That isn't fun. But failure in the terms of, I don't know, getting losing a stack of hit points to a fireball or something. That's failure that feels fun. So that I don't have the answer. I don't know who has the answer, because if they do, they're holding out on the rest of us. But it's there is a middle ground, and there's this tricky thing, particularly with a system like a D20 system. There's a struggle to make every possible result of a roll be interesting, because maybe a 1 can be interesting, maybe a 2, maybe down the low end. But then you've got this whole middle section of failure that isn't interesting or fun. And it's weird when it's put on your turn when you feel like you are doing something wrong because the dice betrayed you.
Well, let me present this thought, and I'll bet someone's made it earlier. There's so many RPG philosophers, and this is an off the brain thing, but maybe it comes down to less about, roles that are on binary success and failure, and more on verbs that are interesting, right? Game design can often be charted out in active verbs, right? Mario has jump, and that jump does a lot. And your D&D characters have a ton of verbs. I mean, we list out all those verbs under the action heading, right? Attack, magic, shove, dash, disengage. I mean, those are all great verbs that D&D gives you on a platter. But for the most part, I think a lot of those verbs are not particularly thrilling. Typically, the magic ones are all pretty exciting because they do something really cool. But attack, divorced of the consequences of the attack, the consequences of which are typically the guy loses hit points, is a fairly toothless verb, all things considered. Now, attack is a great verb if every attack, severs an arm or punctures a lung, and all of a sudden the situation has changed gruesomely. Like, oh my God, he attacked that guy, right? In real life, you'd say, holy crap, he attacked that guy with a knife. But in here, it's, he lost 8 hit points. And I wonder if the problem here is just like, getting damage out of your attack is just trying to squeeze any amount of interest out of an otherwise somewhat limp verb.
I think the reason that attack is a limp verb is because rolling 1 dice to see if you hit your opponent does not simulate the melee of combat very well. One of my favorite fight scenes in any movie ever is Winter Soldier, Captain America Winter Soldier, where Cap fights the Winter Soldier for the first time, right, in the city street. And it is like a beautiful dance, and there's very little CGI, if any, used in it. And I don't even think there's much wire work used in that particular fight, even though Marvel's very good at making Captain America's kicks feel like they are superhuman, but still very weighty and grounded. But what I love about that fight is it's so tense because both combatants keep missing. And you see this moment where Chris Evans gets back up and he kind of like spins around because he's facing the wrong direction when he stands up. And the look on his face is almost panic. And I think at that point, the Winter Soldier pulls out a dagger, tries to stab him in the face. He blocks the attack. Then the Winter Soldier uses his mechanical arm to like push into the dagger, which then hits the truck instead. And then the both of them stagger across this truck with the blade just slicing through it, breaking the glass of the light. And it's just miss, like every attack is missing, but the tension of like those attacks almost hitting is there. And I think creating that feeling in a game of binary, you hit or you miss, really falls to the players and the GM to create those sorts of descriptions, which is a lot of work for a GM, especially when every 3 minutes, somebody's making some sort of attack roll and going like, all right, well, what exciting thing happens this time when you hit and or miss?
Not to mention the complication of using terms like hit and miss and then trying to get us to believe that hit points do not represent actually losing health.
Oh, yes. I knew we'd get there eventually.
The QI whoops just went off again.
Yeah.
What about misses, a failure that's not combat? What about ability checks and things of that nature?
As it currently stands, we're not really talking about this playtest packet much now, but whatever.
Mission accomplished.
I didn't read the book. I need to get them off the topic. Doesn't really provide many tools for failure outside of combat, Because inside combat, you lose hit points. Outside of combat, finding like doing a skill challenge, finding consequences for failing a skill challenge that's not just like, oh, something fell on you, so you take hit points worth of damage, can be a challenge in and of itself. And it's actually why I like the way Exhaustion has been working in the Unearthed Arcana playtest. Brought it back around. Because that -1 up to 10 is a good consequence to impose, I feel, because it's not crippling, but it is a penalty, whereas Exhaustion previously just felt crippling to a player to the point that, oh, well, I'm on disadvantage on all my checks. Okay, I just disengage from the game now. I'm not going to bother making any checks anymore because it's such a penalty. But the point being the difficulty.
Did we get new exhaustion rules in this packet?
Oh, yeah, I didn't get that far. Look, I read the class stuff.
I don't know if they included them in this one. It was a while ago.
I just word search for exhaustion. We don't have any new updates on exhaustion or class features interactive.
I like how new exhaustion is working.
Let's take a look at this for a minute, though. I'm just word searching exhaustion since we're on the topic. There's actually a handful of things that do work with exhaustion in this playtest. The Ranger has a 10th level feature called Tireless that lets them reduce exhaustion by 1 every short rest, which is a pretty big difference from once every long rest.
Yeah, that is good.
I said that.
And that's it.
And that was it. Damn, I was really excited for a minute when I saw those exhaustion pings come up.
I am excited because I think that's a cool mechanic, right? Because that means that you can pull that. And I think that's a reference to the way that exhaustion, pardon me, has been working in 1D&D. In terms of it just being like a blip, 10 blips rather than like a crippling disadvantage, half speed, disadvantage on attack rolls, etc. Because it feels like the Ranger can recover from those penalties quicker, maybe to the point where those penalties don't really stack up that much against the Ranger anymore, but that still feels like something special the Ranger can use and gives us something else within the system that can be used for both penalty but also reward within a magic item or a class or something else.
I love to see mechanics like hit points and stuff treated in a way that they can be used by the players as a resource. For example, when I played a bunch of Hearthstone, you have 30 health in that game, and the Warlock has an ability that lets them spend 2 mana and 2 life to draw a card. Drawing a card is a huge thing in a card game. And so for a lot of Warlocks whose cards deal with doing big things and coming at an HP cost, they tend not to think of hit points as like, endurance or so forth. They didn't think of it as a resource they can spend until they're at risk of their opponent just like taking them down. And the same goes for, say, heat in Lancer. It's not so much, generally you're not taking heat from enemy attacks, so sometimes you can. Usually you're trying to push your mech to go as hard as possible until it starts breaking down on you. And it's only once the enemy starts busting out the flamethrower that it gets really scary, because then you have to deal with heat coming from 2 sources and not getting overwhelmed that way. It would be really cool to see exhaustion used as a sort of life bar / resource tracker in the same way that those might be.
So in a way that we see some games. Oh, I'm sorry, Dael.
I'm drinking. I can't talk.
We talk about games having currency, right? Storytelling currency, where you can spend currency. Maybe hit points. Maybe hit points could be that currency. Maybe exhaustion could be that currency. You want to do something super heroic to change the story? Go ahead. Here's a level of exhaustion, or it costs you X hit points. That would be an interesting mechanic.
Yeah, absolutely. And no, this actually dovetails in great with what I was going to say, because I think that this approach to exhaustion is it encourages DMs to employ it more. Previous to this, it was A, more complicated as a system, and B, anytime that I would, implement it as part of a homebrew thing, suggested as part of a homebrew thing, I would get just swaths of comments saying, you can't do that, they'll die because you're giving them exhaustion. So no one was wanting to use exhaustion because it felt too deadly if you give players more than one level of it, right? And suddenly we've gotten a little more wiggle room there. It feels a little bit more like something that DMs will dip into, and I hope to see that they do. And as a result, then you get this cool thing with, classes like the Ranger, where it's like, here's something that will hopefully actually come into play. Because a big fault of the previous Ranger, I think we could all look back and see, was that a lot of it had to do with interacting with the exploration pillar, which didn't exist. And it still doesn't exist, but giving the Ranger new stuff that interacts with stuff that will be used. That's good. That's good. We see this approach to design in a lot of stuff that they're doing. They have these notes regarding inspiration with the bards saying, look, we tried a different thing. people were hoarding their inspiration. It wasn't working. We want people to use the resources that are available to them. And I think this is another example of that. Now, what was I going to say before about it? I don't remember something. But you know what? I'll answer Shawn's original question, though, because I had a thought about that. So the idea of failure in the place of things like a skill check, there is this interesting thing happening. And I think the designers know it's there and are just kind of choosing to ignore it, right? So you will notice in skill-heavy classes like the Bard or the Rogue that there's this thing where it's like, okay, we'll just increase their bonus. We'll just make it so they have expertise on their skill check so that by the time a Rogue is level 10 or whatever, they're just never going to fail their lockpicking check or their stealth check or whatever because they're going to make that roll one time. And if they fail it, that sucks. That's bad. That's the thing that they're meant to be good at. And there's only one roll, whereas we don't see them implementing these big sort of expertise style boosts to attack rolls for fighters who that is their thing that they're meant to be good at because they're meant to get a lot of attacks that will balance that out over time. But I think when we look at failure with regards to skill checks, we see a lot of outsourcing to DMs. Again, when it comes to, they're going to have to make this, tracking check to follow the goblin's tracks. We have to tell DMs, all right, never put the answer to the next step of the adventure behind just one check, because if they fail it, then that's a problem. So we're just pushing it outwards. Once again, let's not worry about it for game design. We're going to give them as much of a bonus as we can, but also we have to tell the DMs, you got to make sure that there's some way that they can access the information without rolling a check. And that is, it's a little sloppy.
Yeah, I mean, what I would like to see with Exhaustion, as you were saying, was have it used as more of an expendable resource. And I think the way to make it relevant in game, and I think the reason it's not used as much in the current 5th edition isn't just because it's crippling, but also because there's not a lot of things that actually cause exhaustion, like in the rules of the game. There aren't many monsters that, I think there might be one or two, but there aren't many monsters that inflict exhaustion as a penalty as a result of their attack. Or there aren't many like specified effects, even within adventures, that often say like, oh, if this is failed, then they suffer a level of exhaustion. But having that as more of a currency that there's 10 of instead of like 7 of, and it's less crippling, could make that the exploration currency, which is kind of how I use it at the moment, which is like, all right, you want to climb this cliff face, roll for me an ability check. You succeed, you get to the top, that's fine, you drop a rope. If you fail, you still get to the top so that the adventure doesn't come to a standstill, but you're exhausted from the effort of getting up to the top. Now you can drop a rope down and everybody else climbs up. But that makes that the change they've made to the ranger relevant for the ranger to be able to scout ahead, risk those checks, and be able to bounce back from them quicker than somebody else necessarily could. So I'd like to see this new exhaustion kind of embedded further into the game, because I think mechanics that are nice to have but kind of added on, and I'm going to talk about the Resolve dice and the Beast dice from Grimhollow. We've had those relevant in my game for 18 months, and we've used them in maybe 6 sessions, playing weekly, because we just forget that they're there until they're not, because they're not embedded enough into the 5e system for us to remember that they're part of it as much.
Maybe that's the biggest thing that this new refresh of D&D can do. And I hope the designers are thinking about this, is to take the subsystems that kind of gently feather touch sit on top of the core, that are a part of the core, but can be kind of brushed away without too much worry. Maybe what they're hoping to do is integrate them a little bit better. It seems like a lot of these little subsystems were things that either came out of 4th edition and people were very concerned about. Let's not make them too integral so that people can ignore them if they want to. I think of hit dice
talk about them
a lot.
Very quietly.
Or they're just things that are like, oh, I think this will be cool, but we didn't have a lot of time to get great feedback on it in the D&D Next playtest, so maybe we should just, put it in there. I don't remember how integral Exhaustion was to the D&D Next playtest, but I honestly don't remember it much from there, and I kind of felt that way about it coming into 5e, which is like, oh, this is rad. I think everyone loved Exhaustion when 5e first came out, because oh, what a cool little health track system. This is awesome. It goes from bit to bit to bit, and then you're dead. And then, within a year, everyone was like, no, actually, exhaustion is a little.
Well, it's a consequence. It's a serious consequence.
Yeah.
And how much do we want consequences in our game? Which could be the next question I ask.
Really. All right, we are rapidly running out of time here.
Yes.
I'm going to run through my starred notes, all right?
Please do,
Let me
Dael.
see. Generally, I think the bard is improved from the previous time we saw the bard. Great. Something. That's boring. I'm going to skip it.
Do you a quick thought as to why?
Oh, why the bard is better than before?
Yeah.
I feel like they've generally sort of honed in on a better core flavor for the bard. I think before they were like, oh, okay, so it's a jack of all trades. And it kind of just ended up sort of this wishy-washy thing where they were trying to be a healer and the inspiration got weird and everything just got a little bit looser than I would like. I really didn't like the bard last time. And this time they've gone, oh, words of creation, words of power. That's a big thing. That can be a thing that bards, are connected to. And I feel like that one tether that they can come back to has really made a big difference. I hope to see counter charm come up more because I like the concept of counter charm, and previously I just never saw it happen. It just was a little bit too weird. So now being more of a reaction thing, I feel like hopefully we'll see it happen a little bit more often. Also, the capstone, this isn't just for the bard. The capstones across the board instead of the epic boons, big fan. Big fan. The words of creation capstone for the bard, big fan of that.
What's the ranger's capstone?
Never exhausted.
Damn it, just like before.
It's weak.
Should counter charm be at lower level? Because I feel like by the time you get to 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, you have the ability to make your saving throws in many different ways. I feel like counter charm should be something.
What is the level for it?
It's 7th. Okay. I would love to see it at like 2nd even. That's when players seem to need it the most, but that's just me.
Yeah, that's cool.
Oh my god, I'm looking at Foe Slayer and I feel like I'm losing my mind. I have been yelling about this to anyone who will listen since the very first Player's Handbook came out in 2014, the 5e Player's Handbook. It's that the Ranger's capstone ability is garbage. Let me read it to you from the Player's Handbook. At 20th level, you become an unparalleled hunter of your enemies. Once on each of your turns, you can add your wisdom modifier to the attack roll or the damage roll of an attack you make against one of your favorite enemies. You can choose to use this feature before or after the roll, but before any effects of the roll are applied. Okay, that is extremely, extremely weak.
Weak
you
sauce.
look at it's weak sauce. Everyone knows this. 20th level, D&D, 1 D&D Playtest Packet 6. 20th level Foe Slayer, you become an unparalleled hunter of your foes. When your attack roll misses a target of your hunter's mark, I see, no more favorite enemy, get that out of there. You can add your wisdom modifier to the attack roll, not the damage roll, which was weak sauce anyway, fair enough, potentially turning it into a hit. In addition, whenever you hit that target with an attack roll and deal damage to it, you can add your wisdom modifier to the damage. So now we have a floating modifier you have to remember. I'm so angry, especially because the cleric god always works wish as their capstone. Yes. Mm-hmm. What's happening? What is this?
Somebody so just really doesn't like the ranger.
That +4 could be really important at 20th level.
Dan Dillon's on the team now. He loves the ranger.
I think they just didn't want to write something new.
Oh, we forgot to write the ranger's capstone.
I just love in my notes. It literally is. It says the last starred note before this one. It says these capstone abilities are boss, and then the next one is Foe Slayer is not up to snuff. So I agree.
More assistant than boss.
Somewhere in here, I liked the hunter. I think that their rejig of the hunter is pretty good. I had a little rant about monk players wanting a higher hit die because I think the D8 is fine, and then basically the rest of it is about druids because there are two things that stood out to me. I think the druid stuff was largely great. One thing that was improved elemental fury says pick a cantrip you have with a range of 10 feet or more, and it's its range is now 300 feet. And I just cannot fathom a situation in which you need a cantrip to reach 300 feet. That is a wild choice to me. I would love to hear the explanation as to why that is the case.
Is this a druid ability?
This is the druid. Yeah.
So you could thorn whip something 300 feet?
I guess so.
Thorn whip's a druid cantrip, right? And so you pull something next to you from 300 feet away? That's pretty cool.
That's huge. That's great.
Can somebody get my beer? Oh, I gotcha.
But then they have to shotgun it because of the thorns.
That's true.
And then also, I did want to make note of there's the little bit in Druid where they say, oh, and one of the included playtest subclasses is the Circle of Stars. Go and look it up in Tasha's. And I hate that they say that. If you have to go and look it up in a pre-published product that you may or may not own, it is not a playtest subclass. Don't even bring it up.
Sure.
And those are my notes.
That made me mad too. I was like, what? What's happening here?
I want to step back just a few because you mentioned the monk very, very briefly. And that was one change I noted that I really liked was the step up in the monk's damage dice for their unarmed attacks. As someone who tried to play a monk who really wanted to play Iron Fist, basically. And so the idea was that I don't use weapons. I am purely martial. And sub-level 5, that really sucked because even though I'm doing 3 attacks with D4s, I was just getting completely outstripped by a hunter ranger that was in the same party. And he's doing 3d8 or 2d8 plus a d6 on 1 attack versus a d4 on 3 attacks that may or may not hit. Beside the point, that's just my little whinge. I like the fact that they've buffed that up. But interestingly, I was just quickly reading the playtest packet because part of the concept of that character was to multi-class into Paladin to be able to Divine Smite with a fist, which I think has been either
it's still there.
Taken out. You have to have a weapon. Can you unarmed strike?
No, the one they got rid of was ranged unarmed strike. So you can still do it on
ranged smite.
Yeah.
Well, here's my question: is actually
what a time.
My question is actually about multi-classing, which actually maybe it's not a question at all. I was just reading, as a multi-class character, this is the Paladin. You must have a score of at least 13 in the Paladin's primary abilities, Strength and Charisma. Was that always the case, or did it used to be Strength or Charisma?
It's both.
It's both? Okay. Yeah. Then there's no question.
Only a couple classes have that, but some of them are but I think that is one, and there's one other one where it's and. You need both.
Gotcha.
Damn. That makes being a monk paladin nigh on impossible.
Wisdom. Yeah. Yeah, it was. It was a hard multi-class to pull off.
Throwback to the AD&D Paladin where you needed to have like 18 charisma to even be in the class.
I just want to explain myself now because I'm worried that the monk players are going to come for me. All I mean is that I think conceptually, as far as martials go, a monk is supposed to be a glass cannon. So having more constitution and a higher hit die doesn't make sense for me. What you should be asking for is higher damage because you've got the mobility and a little bit of, AC buffing, particularly now that Step of the Wind does dash and disengage. Was that always the case? Anyway, You do both of those with Step of the Wind, and that's great. And I just feel like what you should be asking for is more damage, because then you can live the glass cannon fantasy. Because you're not the tank. You're not the tank, and you're not meant to be the tank. Don't give monks a higher hit die.
Especially because they've got so many, don't they gain access to evasion at some point? I'm not talking about the playtest packet. I'm just talking about sort of 5e monks generally.
They do
now.
in both.
Yes,
in playtest and in Player's Handbook.
But my feeling with the monk was never that they always went down too easy. It was that they're very hard to hit because their AC is usually huge between their con and dex, or is it wisdom and dex? Either way, it's always like 17 or 18 or something like that. And they have tools such as evasion to avoid taking damage on top of that. So speaking of being in the class, also in this class of D20 role-playing systems based on the 5e base system.
Oh, we're
core
back,
system,
baby.
I'm not sure.
We're back. Look at this segue.
Yeah.
So bad.
Oh, yeah.
Did anybody take a look at the core fantasy role-playing playtest packet that came out from Kobold Press? It was 4 pages, so much shorter. Looking at kobolds and small folk as potential lineages.
Yeah, it was fun.
I like it.
All right. Thanks for joining us.
I like rolling gnomes and halflings into one sort of species.
You monster.
Clearly very different.
Oh, you don't mean scientifically. You mean in the game. Never mind.
In a lab.
I made a pigeon rat. Why not? Let's do it. Let's take a very quick question from Mauricio, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who's asking, while we discussed a quest to get our subclasses started... Sorry, I'm doing these ones fresh. I didn't get time to put them into a...
He came back after his break and he was like, I could do it all!
Yeah, exactly.
Left to right.
God.
Left to right, man. Left to right.
Right. Left to right. Gotcha.
Okay.
All right. Finding the question, do we let caster players choose spells freely? Do wizards need to find another wizard, a scroll, a spell book in order to obtain new spells? What about warlocks, clerics, or paladins? Is a request to their patron or god required? How would it work for sorcerers, druids, and arcane tricksters? This is me speaking now. Obviously, the class kind of dictates that new spells can be learned, automatically with a level up, generally speaking. The wizard has their spell book to have capacity to learn other spells. But just to extrapolate on the question a little bit, do you have spells that you restrict unless something can be accomplished beforehand, reviving spells? Or do you have ways for something like a bard or a sorcerer to learn spells in a similar way to the wizard? Discuss.
I've been thinking about this topic ever since we were talking about the subclass quests, and it's made me zero in, and I think this style of play works really only when you design your campaign for it to exist. Like, I can see campaigns that are all very sort of focused on the story, right? You'll follow the story, and sometimes you have 6 or 7 players in it, where things like this that are on a per character basis get very out of hand very quick, because all of a sudden you're doing them for 7 characters. Because every time you do one of these sessions, the big picture story has to go out the window for a minute, and the player character has to go and take spotlight for a while, which I think is great. But you have to really not have a big picture A plot that's taking up all of your effort, particularly because players don't have the predilection towards taking a break that real world people do, or even like sometimes TV show characters do, where it's like, okay, we did something great, now we need to like rest and recover because that was intense. No, they're like, if we even wait for a minute, the villain is going to get back on their feet and we need to go. Otherwise the DM will find some new way to screw us over. And so any indication they should stop intense forward momentum, I tend to find just falls flat on its face or gets them frustrated. So I think it's a really cool idea, but you really have to have your campaign geared up to work around it.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that would be great if the core system said, this is how you should do it. And that gives the DM the cover to do it that way if they choose. And then if they don't want to get involved with, this is what you need to do to get your subclass. Transformations in Grim Hollow generally have to be spawned by something that happens to you or something that you go out and do. And so I like those sorts of things. They can help focus a character and a player more on the story of their character as opposed to just the mechanics of their character. But unless the game system tells you to do it that way, you become the bad guy DM if you force people to do that when the core rules don't say it. So that's my answer. I love to do it though, anytime I can.
You love to be an annoying DM, Shawn.
Oh, I love to be an annoying human being. What do you mean? Just bleeds over.
I feel like there must be something that you could do. The fact that you usually tell players at the end of a session, hey, you've leveled up. And then you have to come back and start the next session. Maybe you could get just a little edge of the flavor just by saying, hey, you learned some new spells. Tell us what they were and how did you get them? Did you like stop and study every night for a week and figure it out yourself? Or did you, find a book in one of the dungeons and, just let them tell you in that moment so that even if it doesn't take time out of the game, and the fact that it supposedly is happening between sessions lets them not take that time out of hunting down the bad guy because it feels like it exists in a time apart.
I'm a huge fan of implicit storytelling, which is kind of a bit of a trope for like Bethesda games specifically, where you walk into a dungeon and it's like, well, there's a skeleton here and there's a dagger over there and there's a dead monster. So, okay, I see what happened here. And sometimes I use, because I want to reward players for exploring with more than just narrative, sometimes I will use magic items, but sometimes I'll use spells. And I'll say, like, you walk into this temple and you can see inscribed on the wall is Elvish or, you know, some language related to the people who built this temple. And you can see that it's a prayer by the looks of it to this deity. And as you read it, you realize actually it has power. This is not just a prayer, but this is a divine spell that they have inscribed onto the wall. And if the cleric wants, they can spend time studying it, maybe spending a short rest in front of it, and they can add that spell to something that they can prepare permanently. That might be a new spell I've invented. That might be a spell from a different spell list that I've brought across to be like, okay, this is something that was locked away, but here you can access it through this specific connection. And I might do that with a Monster Hunter's Grimoire has some spells written in the back of it that it knows to be potentially dangerous, or a wizard's tower has their most powerful spells like inscribed on the walls in one of the rooms, and the whole room is their spell book. And so the players can learn something about the place where they are while also gaining just like a little bit extra that's not necessarily a magic item or not necessarily a something else, but it allows them to build their character through the adventure.
It feels especially relevant that this is a new playtest document week that we're talking about this, because whenever people like to tinker with D&D, they go straight to spells. Because we all have opinions on spells. We all want to make the spells better
so
and the magic
I'm
system
such a tinkerer, and I have never touched spells because they scare me.
Dael, you are the best of us. Thank goodness for you never having touched spells. It sets you apart from the rest of us rabble.
Well, Alpeggio is saying in the chat that it sounds like it could be Monarch's Factory's next video. So there you go. You've been set your task. Good luck. And on that note, that is probably all we have time for this week on the Eldritch Lorecast, the #1 tabletop RPG podcast in all the realms. If you want to continue to follow us, you can do that on YouTube. If you're not watching it there, if you're on Twitch, we do the edited version on YouTube, and we are also where all podcasts can be found. Basically, all good podcasts can be found. Like, subscribe, do all those things, help us grow. We really appreciate everybody who's been with us for a while and all new listeners who are joining as well. We record live on Twitch, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, so you can come hang out with us there. And otherwise, I've been Ben Byrne, here with James Hake, Dael Kingsmill, Shawn Merwin, and we will be back next week. Babada babada. Babada babada.
Babada babada. Signing out.
Babada babada.
And this is Babada of the Field. Babada babada.
We just invented a new language. We did it.